Okay, so we're gonna get started here now that we're finally approaching the customary Berkeley time of 5:10 p.m. I want to thank all of you for attending the event this evening, the Borderlands of Culture in Election Urgency. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Tom McEnany. I'm an associate professor in the departments of comparative literature and Spanish and Portuguese, and we'd like to thank both of those departments for co-sponsoring this event. We also want to give a brief shout out to Yaira Maldonado for designing the beautiful flyer that you all saw in advertising for this event and at the beginning of this talk. Yaira is a graduate student in Spanish and Portuguese at Berkeley. And also want to thank Brianna George at the International Consortium of Critical Theory for all of her help guiding me through some of the features of the Zoom webinar format today. So any mistakes are my own. There might be a few along the way. We're really fortunate to have three wonderful speakers with us here this evening, but before introducing them and also passing the mic to my colleague Rob Kaufman, I want to say just a few things about the format of the webinar for this evening. So the first thing that you should all know if you're attending, I always ask myself this when I'm attending a webinar, you cannot be seen by the panelists. So if you're cooking or you're eating, don't worry about it. We cannot see you. However, in order to communicate with us, what we would prefer you do is that you send your questions at any point during the event to the Q&A tab, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll go ahead and deliver those questions to the panelists after their opening comments. And we really do want to emphasize conversation tonight. So we've asked our invited guest, Professor Saldívar, to present briefer comments than a normal invited talk. And those will be followed by responses from our two local guests, Ivonne del Valle and Alejandra Decker. And then in terms of the chat, please only use the chat if you have reactions during the course of the conversation, brief reactions or suggested links that you'd like to share with everyone here. Obviously, don't be a troll in the chat. And the last thing is, I don't know if we have any blind attendees this evening, but if we do, and if you're bothered by the chat function, because I know screen readers sometimes can create a lot of extra noise or confusion between what's in the chat and what the main speakers are saying, please just notify us and I'll go ahead and disable the chat. So finally, the last sponsor of tonight's event is El Grupo. And I'll just say a few comments about El Grupo and then Rob will maybe develop them further. El Grupo, as many of you will know if you've received the emails for this event, was initiated in the spring of 2019 by undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty in Spanish and in comparative literature and Spanish and Portuguese. And now it's connected to a number of other departments and programs on campus. And the main thing that I'll say about it is it was really developed in order to bring together people who had a focus or interest in Chicanx, Latinx, Latin American, and broader Lusophone and Hispanophone cultures and literature, and in particular to help establish kind of mentorship relationships between undergraduate students and graduate students. So if anyone attending the event tonight is interested in El Grupo, if you are an undergrad and you're looking for advice about going to graduate school, or you just would like to meet and speak with other undergrads who share your interests or graduate students who might be able to tell you a little bit more about the process of going to graduate school, please email either me or Professor Kaufman at the conclusion of the event, and we'll connect you to that conversation. So like I said, I'm going to introduce the two guests in addition to our main invited guest this evening. And we're really fortunate to have two members of the Spanish and Portuguese department here at Berkeley as part of the conversation. Ivonne del Valle is Associate Professor of Colonial Studies and the author of over a dozen articles, as well as the book Escribiendo desde los márgenes, Colonialismo y Jesuitas en el siglo XVIII. Professor del Valle is also the co-editor of special issues of journals dedicated to topics including radical politics and/or the rule of law in Mexico, Carl Schmitt and the early modern world, and most recently, Iberian empires and the roots of globalization. Her current book-length manuscript investigates the drainage of the lakes of Mexico City and the implications of this project from the 15th century onward for how people have thought about violence, colonization, and at least one paper that I saw her deliver recently 21st century labor and ecology in Mexico City. We're also joined by Alejandra Decker, a PhD student in Hispanic languages and literatures, whose research focuses on the literature and culture of Greater Mexico. Her interests cross into the fields of science and technology studies, gender and women's studies, and indigenous languages and literatures. And her current research explores new approaches to Mexican modernity by linking literary studies to the engineering sciences in late 19th century Mexico. She's currently writing on the politics of light in Ignacio Manuel Altamirano's novel El Zarco, and its parallel discourse in the Anales de la Asociación de Ingenieros y Arquitectos de México. Outside of the classroom, Alejandra is active in graduate student organizing around issues of economic justice and campus diversity, and currently serves as the co-coordinator of the Latin American Art and Literature Working Group. So please welcome Ivonne and Alejandra. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Rob Kaufman to introduce our invited guests this evening.
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay? Thanks, everyone, for being here. When El Grupo was thinking about this being our first event formally of the year, and we knew it would likely take place in late October, probably close to the election, we couldn't think and didn't think of anything that would be within miles of being as appropriate as asking Ramón Saldívar to come and talk to us to reconsider what it means today to think about his 2006 book, The Borderlands of Culture, Américo Paredes and the Transnational Imaginary. Everyone knows the situation, so I won't belabor it, but I will say that besides the scholarly interests that people in El Grupo has, it doesn't escape any of us that we're in the situation of asking Ramón to talk with us and to talk with Ivonne and Alejandra. After 4 years, or let's say 5, in which the challenge to the citizenship of Black people in the United States and of Latino people, as well as people of Islamic background, could not be more overt. And the much more than symbolic aim to return to pre-Civil War and to an early awful Supreme Court issuing Dred Scott v. Stanford. I'm almost quoting and I think barely paraphrasing that Supreme Court before our Civil War in this country. The Black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect, no citizenship. It again doesn't escape any of us that Ramón is thinking in the book and thinking anew with the book and asking us to do the same about what that means for us now. I want more lightly and in thanks to just add a couple thank yous to the ones that Tom already gave. And that's to, in the critical theory program, Patty Dunlap, Miranda Schönbrunn, Kai Nugent, and Dan Blanton for being of great help in getting us to the technological assistance that we needed to try and make this happen. Thank you so much to all of them. And with that, I want to begin to introduce Ramón, about whom I could easily, without exhausting the subject, take the entire hour and a half or 2 hours, but I'm going to honor our attempt to try and be informal and conversational and be a little bit shorter than I otherwise would. Ramón Saldívar is Professor of English and Comparative Literature and the Hoagland Family Professor of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama in 2012. In March 2013, President Obama appointed him to the National Council on the Humanities, which is the advisory board of the NEH. Professor Saldívar is Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Studies at Stanford and has served as chair of both the Departments of English and of Comparative Literature there. From 2012 to 2019, he was the Burke Family Director of Stanford's Bing Overseas Studies program, and he's also served as director of Stanford's Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. He was faculty athletic representative from 2002 to 2005, and again in 2010 to 2011. He's currently serving on the Executive Council of the Modern Language Association. Professor Saldívar's teaching and research focus on literary criticism and literary theory, 19th, 20th, and 21st century literary studies, and the history of the novel and other narrative forms, issues concerning transnationalism, globalization, and decolonization, critical race theory, comparative studies in race and ethnicity, and US Latinx studies. He's the author and editor of 4 books and numerous other scholarly publications. In 2006, he was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize in US Latina and Latino and Chicana and Chicano Literary and Cultural Studies for the book we've asked him to revisit in light of today's socio-political circumstances. The Borderlands of Culture, Américo Paredes and the Transnational Imaginary, Duke University Press, 2006. During the 2019-2020 academic year, Professor Saldívar was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and he's currently working on a new project tentatively titled Speculative Realism and Historical Fantasy in Contemporary American Fiction. I want to say a little bit more informally and a little bit less from the official CV that not exactly, but almost the first 4 words in this book are the following 4 words: Marcial González and Raúl Coronado. The reason that's important is that way back then, when this book was being written, they were working with and for and on this book with Ramón, and it's just a very typical gesture of his own generosity that that's where he began to address the audience for the book. With those he was working with, he would hesitate to say leading or guiding, but that's what we all know he was doing. I was lucky enough to have that experience as an assistant professor at Stanford, and seeing and knowing what Ramón and his work has meant for literally thousands and thousands of younger scholars, especially but not only in the Latinx communities around the United States and elsewhere around the world, but also for some of us who have been lucky enough to have him at our back as we begin our own careers. It's very special, and he's also someone beloved himself, as now are Marcial and Raúl, members of Berkeley's academic community and themselves guiding people, as is Ivonne del Valle. It seemed appropriate in that light. And because Ramón over the years has been here a lot at Berkeley, and in fact, there have been points at which it was only metaphorical and at other points quite literal to talk about his family at Berkeley. I just want to mention that the ways that he thinks about community in and across different communities make it clear that I think he'd like us to mention that his work and his affiliations go, on the one hand, way back at Berkeley to figures who were almost alone in forging paths decades and decades ago here. Marco Portales, Carlos Muñoz, Alex Zaragoza, much more recently, but still crucially, Genaro Padilla, younger people like today in sociology, Cristina Mora, and I've already mentioned Ivonne. At the same time, it's also crossed with people in various disciplines, but connected here at Berkeley. No longer with us, but here with us in his work, Tulio Alperín Dongui, and our beloved and still in the mix, Emerita Francine Macielo. Ramón's work on Américo Paredes, the thinking with him that he and others have done about something El Grupo is trying to think about quite literally today is the 50th anniversary, the commemoration of the 1970 Chicano moratorium against the war in Vietnam, and all the things it's meant since then and means today. The ways we're commemorating it now, this is really also one of our points of departure here today. And in that light, finally, before turning it over to Ramón, we want to give one more kind of commemoration that we hope will likewise prove generative for the thinking Ramón will be asking us in a few minutes to do about the borderlands of culture and lo de hoy día, the situation we're encountering today. Ramón emphasizes that Paredes began as a teenager, if not even before, como poeta ante todo, as a poet before anything else. And in some sense, Paredes was always returning to that enabling spark and source. It's in that light and noting everything that Ramon's generous visit here today allows us to push forward with, very much including our own communities here at Berkeley, that we want to remember someone no longer physically present with us, but whose work and therefore whose still living thought, engagements, and voice has just been happily made all the more present to us. I'm referring to our much beloved late colleague, teacher, friend, great reader and interlocutor of Paredes, and incomparable poet and critic, Alfred Arteaga. It's just at this moment that the gorgeous edition of Alfred's collected poems, Chicancuicatl, has appeared from one of our contemporary poetry world's most vital publishing houses, Wesleyan University Press. Rigorously and lovingly edited and introduced by David Lloyd, and with a luminous foreword by Cherie Moraga, Chicancuicatl, Alfred's collected poems, is yet another in the series of miracles that Wesleyan's poetry series editor, Susanna Tamanin, somehow keeps making sure enter the public sphere. The book is likely to change the landscapes of contemporary poetry in and across a number of languages in ways we imagine Paredes is smiling about still. Please go to Wesleyan University Press's website and get a hold of it, read it, reread it, read it aloud. Hear the poetry's many sources that indeed include the Chicano moratorium itself, not to mention so many of the questions that Paredes and Ramon's revoicing of Paredes' questions for us this afternoon will ask us to take up. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Ramón, and please, le toca a ti.
Thank you to all of you. And Rob, wow, that's, over the top. And I really appreciate your words. You can hear me okay, I take it? Good. Rob's comments remind me what we all already know, and that is that despite the supposed rivalry between Stanford and Berkeley, we're a deeply embedded intellectual community, and it's a pleasure to be part of it in this virtual way this afternoon. Before I begin, I want to say a couple of words of thanks to Tom McEnany and to Rob Kaufman for having invited me to participate in this forum with you tonight. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I'm with a pleasure and a delight. This event has given me the opportunity to get to know Ivonne del Valle and Alejandra Decker, and I look forward to your comments and our conversation as well. Well, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and dive into what I want to say. My topic, as you know, is the Borderlands of Culture, this book that I wrote on Don Americo Paredes, but really to place it in the context of where we are today. And so I want to begin by recapping some of the issues in the book and why I think that Paredes's words from the Borderlands of Culture are still very pertinent for understanding the crisis that we find ourselves within today. For those of you who don't know, Americo Paredes, who lived from 1915 to 1999, was one of the founders and early practitioners of what has come to be known as ethnic, race, and border critical studies in the US. At the time of his death in 1999, Paredes really was one of the most respected of American intellectuals. Well, why is that? How so? What is it about his work that gathered such esteem? Well, his first book, With His Pistol in His Hand, A Border Ballad and Its Hero, published in 1958, was important for a number of reasons. First of all, probably it was because it went well against the grain of the accepted analytical methods of the day. It was interdisciplinary before there was a word like interdisciplinary, or at least a concept. It combined literary, sociological, historical, and musicological analyses of traditional border corridos in new ways. And maybe more importantly, it also offered a critique and a response to the official histories of the relations between Anglos and Mexicans along the border. Typical of those histories were works, for example, by the historian Walter Prescott Webb, Webb, in his 1935 book, The Texas Rangers, has this to say about the border and the people who live on the border. So this is Prescott Webb. He says, quote, "Without disparagement, it may be said that there is a cruel streak in the Mexican nature, or so the history of Texas would lead one to believe. This cruelty may be a heritage from the Spanish of the Inquisition. It may be attributed partly to Indian blood. Among the common class, ignorance and superstition prevail, making the rabble susceptible to the influence of designing leaders." This leads Paredes to respond with biting sarcasm in one of his essays, quote, "Professor Webb does not mean to be disparaging. One wonders what his opinion might have been when he was in a less scholarly mood and not looking at the Mexican from the objective point of view of the historian," close quotes. Paredes was very aware of the challenge to tradition that his work was making from the very beginning. In the introduction to With His Pistol in His Hand, he explicitly links the struggles for political rights and justice of the border people of South Texas with the struggles of other peoples on the margins of power around the world. But he was also very aware of the specific regional character of the US-Mexico border. So for that reason, Paredes claimed that the history of the border resides in the everyday stories of the Mexican-American communities, in their jokes, their vernacular stories and folklore, their songs and music, their food, as well as in their art and literature, in short, in all of their cultural practices. History from the Mexican side was to be found in vernacular forms, in folklore, in legends and family histories, telling what has come to be known today as history from below. In what has become one of Paredes' most well-known ideas, he says in one of his early essays also that, quote, "Every Mexican knows that there are two Mexicos. One is found within the boundaries of the Republic of Mexico. The second Mexico, Mexico de afuera, as Mexicans call it, is composed of all the persons of Mexican origin in the United States," unquote. So the composite hybrid of these two Mexicos is what Paredes called Greater Mexico. His version of national identity thus cuts across political borderlines to include the everyday lifestyles and historical realities of the transborder experience. This is one way to understand what Paredes means to live between two worlds, the title of one of his books of poetry. So what I've given you right now is basically the main story that we know about Paredes and his work as a scholar from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The scholar of the US-Mexico borderlands who identified many of the issues that we still grapple with today. However, before Americo Paredes, who helped define the US-Mexico borderlands, there was another Paredes, another Americo Paredes. In 1945, Paredes, like many other young Mexican-American men and women, shipped out for the war in the Pacific. Paredes landed in devastated Nagoya, Japan in 1945, with the first American troops to arrive in post-war Japan. He was there to help manage the occupation of that defeated country and its intended transition from a militaristic empire to a West-leaning, anti-communist, pro-American democracy. Transferred to Tokyo, Paredes served as a staff writer and then as the political editor for Pacific Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of the US Armed Forces in the Pacific. From 1945 to 1950, Paredes served as a member of the US Army of Occupation in Japan, writing for Pacific Stars and Stripes, as I said, and as a correspondent for the Mexico City daily Universal, and then later as head of humanitarian supply coordination for the International Red Cross in China and in Korea. So what does Asia have to do with Americo Paredes? What does this have to do with the US-Mexico borderlands in the current political moment of today's political urgency, the title for our talk tonight? What is the Asian connection to the US borderlands, and why should we pay attention to it? Paredes' experiences in Asia in the post-war era, I think, were crucial for his later formulation of that idea of Greater Mexico that I mentioned a moment ago. On his return to the US in 1950, he would begin to use those experiences as core features of his studies of the borderlands. Paredes's time in Asia provided a defining paradigm for his understanding of the racial discord and conflict, the ambiguous nature of post-war occupation, the formation of modern polities and citizenries, and perhaps most importantly, the role of culture in understanding national and international conflict. Composed between 1945 and 1950, Paredes's writings from Asia broach a broad array of topics, including what would this new post-war Asian world under American occupation look like? What shape would its political forms and social traditions take? How would its language, its media, its folklore, and arts evolve? What would it be like to live in a land suddenly inundated with all of these rich white men who were now unmistakably in control? How did Paredes's experience as a racialized American soldier, journalist, and humanitarian aid worker affect his understanding of the US-Mexico borderlands? In short, what did he learn in post-war Asia? On his return to the US from Japan, China, and Korea in 1950, Paredes attempted to make sense of the new geographies of citizenship, the new forms of modernity, and the persistence of old conflicts he had seen in Asia in relation to post-war national forms. After his experiences in the Far East, Paredes saw the possibility of a theoretical repositioning of modern citizenship in new multinational versions. This is what is implied, I think, by the notion of Greater Mexico, the transnational cultural space inhabited by persons of Mexican descent that overlaps the sovereign nations of Mexico, of Central America, and the US. Greater Mexico was created by war, political maneuvering, the great labor migrations of the 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries, and the power of transnational communities of shared fate. His writings, Desde Tokyo and Desde China, the titles of his Spanish language columns in Universal, deal with issues of personal, cultural, and national identity, coded with a Latinx tinge, of course, that is, from a borderlands perspective, as represented by an American intellectual of color. Consider the nuances of his subject position when he was in Japan. A Mexican-American soldier in the US Army of Occupation, a native of racist segregation-era South Texas, familiar with a history of conquest and occupation in the American borderlands, a journalist and humanitarian aid worker. Paredes himself came to see its historical significance as he lived the Asian community of knowledge, observing it, writing about it, and even marrying into it. In Tokyo in 1948, he married Amelia Shizu Nagamine, a Japanese national, the daughter of a Japanese father and Uruguayan mother. So, going east to discover what we now call the Global South, Paredes saw the basis of an ecology of ideas concerning local customs and global conditions that he would develop more fully in theoretical and methodological terms on his return to the US as a scholar of the US-Mexico borderlands. That is, Paredes came to see that the conflicts between Anglos and Mexicans in the borderlands would need to be formulated in ways that did justice to the lessons of racial and cultural conflict and nation construction that he learned in Asia. In Japan, China, and Korea, Paredes first advanced a project that came to full fruition on the US-Mexico border of understanding the messy nature of transnational realities, emerging from nations and working across them. No better example, I think, of a transnational reality exists than Greater Mexico. I think this is especially important for us today. This is clear when we take Paredes's notion of Greater Mexico with its transnational and global implications into consideration in relation to the concept of the Global South. Remember that the idea of the Global South first emerged in the post-World War II era from the fact that, with few exceptions, practically all of the world's industrially developed countries lay to the north of the so-called developing countries. According to Berkeley's own sociologist Saskia Sassen, today, at the beginning of the 21st century, the term Global South refers to a new phase of global capital. For Sassen, the Global South designates primarily the territories that have been subjected to a post-Keynesian financial logic of land grabs, to the imposition of debt as a disciplining regime, to the massive extraction of mineral and human value, and to the massive expulsion of persons from middle-class status into abject poverty. The key word in all of this is expulsion. That underdevelopment of countries at a peripheral remove from the core of metropolitan economic power didn't just happen. It didn't happen by accident. Underdevelopment occurred as a result of active forces shaping that underdevelopment. For this reason, it is fair to say that various Southern economies and cultures share comparable experiences of marginalization and unequal access to the resources of globalization that differentiate them from fully developed and hegemonic cultures. So, more than merely serving as geographical markers, terms like Greater Mexico and the Global South refer to this process of growing immiseration of governments and economies, launching a new phase of global migration and people trafficking. I think that nowhere is this process of immiseration today more evident or more severely acute than at the US-Mexico border. The current humanitarian crisis on the border reflects the deadly combined effects of US policies of massive forced displacement due to drug wars, mass incarceration, plus the generalized denial of the right to asylum. Legal scholar and border theorist Camilo Perez Bustillo is one of the key persons outlining some of the ways of understanding the border today in the context of national sovereignty, immigration policy, human rights, and reparational and transitional justice. Perez's work is grounded in research and fieldwork undertaken as a researcher affiliated with the Human Rights in Trauma Mental Health Program since September of 2019, and as a co-founder of a nonprofit human rights initiative called Witness at the Border. Exploring the global impact of the current pandemic on migrants, refugees, and displaced persons, Perez examines the policies and practices that have been implemented on a global scale to identify trends within the evolving relationship between migration policy, migrant rights, and human rights. Perez and the Witness at the Border project show how the limitations on the rights of migrants have long been grounded on expressions of racism and xenophobia and based on the supposed imperatives of national security. He reminds us that these same rationales have long been imposed in contexts ranging historically from 19th century US territorial expansion after the Mexican War, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, early 20th century impositions of national origins, quotas in immigration, massive deportations of Mexican and Mexican Americans during the Depression era 1930s, Japanese internment during World War II, the Bracero program of the 50s. They are related also to the 21st century actions such as the Muslim travel ban with magnified effects at the US-Mexico border. In all of these cases, the one thing that runs as the line of continuity is that race, not legal status, is the issue. So all of these repressive measures have a common history. Today, we're witnessing another purge, another constriction and fortification of the border. Trump's peculiar blend of racism and xenophobia, opportunism and cynicism, foolishness and cunning, cruelty and hypocrisy demand attention, according to Carmen Bulosa in her new book, Let's Talk About Your Wall. In other words, we've been here before, but in the hands of the current administration, these historically repressive patterns have been deepened and reinforced in the most shameful and malicious way by the cynical use of measures framed in terms of the global public health emergency triggered by the COVID pandemic. Pandemic-related measures in the US have included unprecedented peacetime closings of the southern and northern borders and the uncontrolled deportation of COVID positive and negative detainees to their home countries, thus triggering preventable secondary outbreaks in countries such as Guatemala, Haiti, and Colombia, and of course in the improvised refugee camps on the Mexican side of the border. These human rights violations in turn have laid the groundwork for the designation of the US-Mexico border region by the Trump administration as ground zero for US immigration policy in the face of an impending invasion by asylum seekers, supposedly. This combination of repressive immigration policies and inflammatory rhetoric culminated recently in the massacre at the Walmart in El Paso in August of 2019, according to Perez and others like historian Kathleen Bulow, who are studying white supremacist militias. Not another random mass shooting. That massacre was done by a gunman who openly acknowledged that he intended to target people of Mexican origin. These matters require that we explore the range of similar crises worldwide, including the possible relationship between the immigration and human rights crisis at the US-Mexico border and equivalent challenges in Europe and the Asian-Pacific maritime borders. So we need to question, what is the relationship today between racist and xenophobic violence within the US and similar instances in Europe, such as the Utoya massacre in Norway in 2011, or at the Asian-Pacific borders in Australia and New Zealand with the Christchurch massacre in 2019? Is there any relationship between these kinds of actions? Well, these actions were carried out, after all, as Perez notes, quote, by an Australian gunman who identified with US white supremacist ideology, claimed inspiration from the Utoya assassin, and was in turn invoked as a positive example by the El Paso shooter. So there's a link there. The unfolding situation at the US-Mexico border represents both a humanitarian crisis and a crucible for serious human rights violations, things like family separation, the mass detention of families and children in inhumane conditions, and the generalized denial of the right to seek asylum. From the human rights perspective, family separation is both an act of torture and of enforced disappearance. It produces lasting emotional, psychological, and physical consequences among its victims, especially the children forcibly taken from their parents. Such actions give rise to claims for reparations, for truth and justice that activate the kinds of frameworks associated with processes of transitional justice. All of this leads me to say that after his experiences in Asia, it became possible for Paredes to see the border as just such a transnational space, a border that extended beyond the geopolitical lines separating Mexico and the US to encompass a larger sphere of engagement and response extending hemispherically across the Americas, North and South. The same borderland matters that Paredes studied throughout his career as a journalist, humanitarian aid worker, and scholar of the borderlands, and for which he offered some possible understandings, are the crucial questions that drive our world today. They will not necessarily be answered by the election of 2020, but they are, without a doubt, a measure of what is at stake and of the gravity of the task that lies before us. So I'll end there. Thank you. And I look forward to our comments and conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Tom and to Rob for organizing, and to Ramón for that great talk. And for those of you who haven't read his book, the book that we're talking about today, what he presented is an example of what he's doing in the book. That is to say, Paredes allows him to go to places that are important and urgent. And one of the things that he did not mention today, but that I would like to emphasize, and what I'm going to do just now, it's emphasize some of the things that Ramón already said, and also thinking about the election, trying to see other perspectives. But I thank him especially for ending in that way, reminding us that what is happening in this side of the border is torture. But so what he's doing in the book is helping us to see how Paredes brought genre that were considered minor, corridos, ballads, into something that is worthwhile, and that, as he says, he's writing against the grain, a book that is it's great, and that allowed him to see how from a ballad we can talk about community, and a community that is, as Ramon said, also a greater Mexico or transnational, that is expansive, and that this is important for one reason. It's important because it means that people who are now working in the fields, people who are washing dishes, people who are cleaning houses, they do have a culture too. And it's a culture as valid as the culture that allows someone to be an academic and study Henry James, which is one of the possibilities that Americo Paredes turned down in order to study something else. And that in terms of election, to remind people that Latinx and many other groups, ethnic groups that have been marginalized, have a culture is very important, especially in election times, because of the things that Ramon mentioned that are quite urgent. But I would also like to say that at the same time, I think that I recognize the urgency of the times, and that there's a certain person, the non-nameable person, that needs to go. But that I think the stakes are so high that once he goes, the other one, the next that hopefully will win, would also have to go. And I'm saying this because I think that that as Ramon reminded us, it's not only that we have to think about the deep past, in which even academics, like the quote that Ramon read at the beginning, those type of the people saying that Mexicans or people of Latino descent were cruel by definition, and also thinking about the Clash of Civilizations, the 1996 book by Samuel Huntington. It's academic work, and it's the president of the United States, and it's many people comments that we get in the street. Like once, many years ago, a friend of mine told me, when I was telling her how reading as a child, I don't remember what, but it was some Greek author. She is a very educated woman who would never vote for Trump, but she would gladly vote for Biden. She said that she had never thought that the Greeks had been translated into Spanish. That is to say, it's it's this network, this chain of insults, and that is quite problematic, and that has led us to a situation like the one we're living now. But that it goes beyond Trump, and part of me also thinks that we need to say we do have a culture. We people washing dishes have a culture. We people feeding, bringing food to your table, we have a culture. But it's also, to me, another part of me would think, like, why do we need to say that to a culture or to a civilization that has made all of this possible? That is to say, we're not, it would be also interesting not to look for recognition from a culture that made possible family separation, that made possible Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, that made possible Pinochet in Chile, that made possible, I mean, we can think about a stream, and to think about how in many ways other cultures, that global south that Ramon was talking about, also has a lot to teach the US. And in these elections, I'm thinking about the elections and the options that we have in the US. And I'm just reminded also of what happened in Bolivia recently, where the new president, Luis Arce, is the person who took Bolivia, who made the economic growth in Bolivia really possible. And not only that economic growth for the higher classes, but especially the opposite, no? That made economic growth for the underclasses, the peasants, and Bolivia, the indigenous communities possible. And that the vice president is David Choquehuanca, who it's he's grew up speaking Aymara, and when he's talking in his rallies, he was talking about Tupac Katari and Bartolina Sisa, who were two of the leaders of the greatest anti-colonial rebellion in the Americas in the 18th century. That is to say that it would be, for me, the idea would be not only to say, no, we're not criminals and rapists, but it's like, it's to also try to put the US in perspective. And the US right now, to me, even looking at this election, seems like it should be humbled down, because it's like the examples that are coming from other parts of the world are showing how Latin America is not behind its, and not only Latin America, the global South. The example of Chile also this weekend comes to mind. It's that it should learn. The US needs to learn from other places, not only recognize the culture, but go beyond that, because and also, I mean, I'm not forgetting that there have been many important demonstrations in this country also against the brutality that it's the axis of this regime. So I would like that to think that the humbling, and I brought especially the government in Bolivia, because Luis Arce, again, is the engineer of an economic improvement for Bolivian people. And I'm thinking also about the human rights, and I'm thinking about how important it is to have political rights, but also that our community, the Global South community, and I'm including in that Global South community here in the US, people of African descent, is that it's also very important to achieve economic equality. And I was reading that Latinos and African American people, they're at the lower strata of the medium income in this country. So that is also something with that we should also be thinking about. And I think that we're going to have a dialogue later, and I welcome that. But that's all that I have to say now. Thank you, Ramon. And just I'd like to think, do we really need then the recognition of about a culture, or where are the examples that we can think about that could teach the US exactly that teaching and humbling that it needs? No, thank you.
Thank you, Ramon, for your book and your talk, and Ivonne for starting the conversation. Also to Tom and Rob for organizing this charla, and for having me. As a Mexican-American graduate student, it's exciting to be at an event that brings me closer to my home instead of further away from it. And I'm sure many of you in the audience feel this too, that seeing your culture represented in a university space by people from your own culture, it's special. And this book, The Borderlands of Culture, reminds me that the representation and recognition of Mexican-American cultural forms has been very contested. Even if, as Ivonne has mentioned, that recognition might not be what we need, that those still are battles that were hard fought and are ongoing. And this book seems to return us to that lineage of resistance at a very timely moment. Where should I just go? So I think as a point of introduction, I would just say that I grew up with corridos. Mi mamá siempre los escuchaba. And they were the sound of Mexico in my home. They were and they are the sound of Mexico. From Los Tigres del Norte, Ramón Ayala, Los Tucanes de Tijuana. It's a complex thing how a sound comes to stand in for a nation, that for transnational communities, a musical genre can become the way that you know your country and your heritage. And it's certain that corridos and música del norte in general, banda, norteñas, these are the Mexican genres that dominate the communities I know, the Spanish-speaking communities I know in the United States, particularly in the West and the Southwest, that these are genres that are on our radios and they're in our homes. So it is through these genres for me that I understand some of the terms, Ramon, that you used to read Américo Paredes, things like the transnational imaginary, folklore as a critical discourse, history as remembrance and as performance. And for those of us who grew up in a culture that listens to corridos, these concepts are almost intuitive. We grow up in the culture that knows corridos as more than songs. We know them as history, as politics, as community, as forms of memory. And they have served us as alternatives to a nation, to a territory, and to an official history. So in this book, I really appreciated the emphasis on Américo Paredes' commitment to studying the unofficial texts of history, how he, as you say, first elaborated in the realm of the imaginary, topics that would later inform his theories in the social sciences. And I think this is a really crucial gesture, that he went to history by way of folklore and song. And it gets to why I believe it is important to study Latinx literature and culture precisely in this election moment, in a time of political crisis, when, as we know, we're facing very direct threats to our citizenship rights, voter suppression, outright white supremacy. And what I gained from this book is that it seems that turning to cultural forms when our citizenship is under attack, this is a Mexican-American practice with historical precedent. And from what I understand of your study, Ramon, it's one of the reasons that Paredes chooses to study folklore and popular Mexican culture in general is in response to a deep attack on Mexican citizenship, to a loss of political and social rights caused by the Mexican-American War. That this was a moment when suddenly secondary and non-citizen status was assigned to people of Mexican descent in the United States. And so that it's in this context of political crisis that corridos, como el corrido de Gregorio Cortés, become alternative histories. And that this is just a result of living under imperialism, maybe not even a specifically Mexican-American phenomenon, but that any time where the public sphere, the official history, or the dominant culture is no longer hospitable, there become other cultural forms that step in. And it is in this context that I understand corridos to step in to create a sense of community within marginalized groups, not just in their content, which does narrate important Mexican events and local histories for people spread out across the globe, but also in the social practices that they encourage. Thinking that corridos, in my experience, are always played during moments of community congregation. They were played at parties growing up, life events, in the daily work, as background music, to cleaning, to working in the fields. And in that process, they turned these everyday tasks into spaces that serve to reinforce Mexican identity in the ongoing face of North American imperialism. And so to bring it to today, to the question for me of why it remains important to study Latinx culture and literature in a moment that might seem to push us more towards a civic life, political activism, public work. It's that, to me, preserving unofficial histories, which is the work that I see Américo Paredes as starting for Chicano scholars, that is political work. It is political work, and it is not over for us as political work. Precisely because white supremacy is still a threat, minority communities continue to face a secondary and non-citizen status in the United States. And that as long as that is still our reality, that the official record is not ours or is not representative of our culture, then we're going to have to keep doing political and historical work from unassuming places, from places like culture and literature, places like corridos, which continue to be a safe house for anti-imperialist ideas, a reservoir of our histories, and hopefully a congregating point, a continuous congregating point for resistant transnational Mexican politics. So that is kind of how I'm thinking of this contribution the need to continue studying Latinx, Chicanx, and Latin American literature and culture, even when we seem to be pulled out into the public sphere, away from those forms.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Thank you, Ivonne. Thank you, Ramon. We're going to turn now to the third part of our conversation here, which is just an opportunity and conversation for Alejandra, Ivonne, and Ramon to speak to each other. And please, those of you who are in attendance, don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the top of your screen. And then we can, either the speakers can go ahead and see those questions themselves, or I can read them out for them. So I'm going to turn it over to the three of you, and we'll await the additional questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
So maybe I can start the conversation by just thanking both Ivonne and Alejandra for those very perceptive and thought-provoking comments. I appreciate them immensely, mostly because I'm learning from what you're saying and how I can further my own thinking about the matters that you're raising. Just a word, first of all, to Yvonne's good point that why do we need recognition? Why in the case of Paredes' first book, With His Pistol in His Hand, did he feel that it was necessary to even make the point that Mexican communities did have culture? And I think that's always an extremely crucial question, because one never wants to begin from the assumption that that on anybody's part that there is no culture. I think Paredes' point, especially in those early years, and when he was writing With His Pistol in His Hand in the 1950s, we're still in the thick of the most racist regime that one can imagine in the entire world, probably comparable only to what will later become apartheid in South Africa. So the counterpoint of underscoring the lessons that were already being made in everyday life among Mexicanos in their conversations with one another, over their kitchen tables, in their churches or other community groups. These were truths and historical facts that they well knew, but these were also historical facts that were not being taught in the schools. I'm a product of the public school system of South Texas in the 1960s. And believe me, nothing of what I read in Paredes was in my history books. It was as if there was no culture, as if there was no history, as if there was nothing to value in the Mexican world. And Paredes knew that we knew it. We knew that there was. And it wasn't recognition that we were seeking so much as an attempt not to have official history override history from below, so that children, making their way through the Anglo-American public schools would have a counterpoint to what they were listening from the figures of authority, their teachers. So, it was more that, I guess the question really for me boils down to, who is history for? Why do we write history? Partly it's to educate the other, but it's also partly to commemorate and remember who we are for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's part of the difficulty that a historian, a folklorist, a scholar of culture always faces. Who am I writing for, and for what reason? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I take Alejandra's point. She said some of those things herself. Her points are, I think, make a similar argument that it was partly what Ivonne said as well, that, culture doesn't just come from those sanctioned official places of prestige, but really imbues who we are and what we do. So thank you for your good comments, both of you.
And at one moment in your book, you mentioned how given, and I think Américo Paredes was even referring to Renato Rosaldo.
Yes, yes.
He said, no, I was not writing. So I understand that I get what was happening at a certain point, but like the question, that is to say that in Paredes's time,
Yes.
he said, I'm writing a brief.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Right.
A brief,
Yeah, no, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And it's to me, it's like at one point, the ones who should demonstrate their culture to us,
Mm-hmm.
it's somebody. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I mean, there's a big difference between, there's lots of different powers to various kinds of discourse. Mm-hmm. And one power that he wanted to marshal was the brief, exactly as you say.
Yeah.
I do see that the politics of representation currently, they sometimes don't advance our needs in the way that we imagine, that you put Latinos and Mexican American culture in that equivalent platform as other forms that have historically been given that, but that representation doesn't end up bleeding over into changing the institutions or changing the forms. And so it is a move to have both of those positions at the same time, to still be advocating for the recognition of Mexican American culture, while also somehow imagining a world where recognition is not what we strive for.
Yeah, no, I agree. And for me, that was one of the reasons why I felt that that we needed to think more fully about the implications of what it means to conceive of something like Greater Mexico. What is implicit in that? Well, in some ways it's totally obvious. That is that we're situating ourselves not just in a very local context, not just in a regional context, but in dynamics that permeate the globe, and power and struggles against existing powers around the world. There is a long history of struggle toward justice, and here on the border we have one instance of it. It's much deeper than just simply an instance, of course, but it is part of a world history that needs to be part of our understanding as well. I loved, Ivonne, your anecdote about the person being amazed that the Greeks had been translated into Spanish. We all have probably similar versions of that story.
Exactly, and it was a highly educated person.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So there's one question so far in the Q&A portion here that we've received, and I'll just go ahead and read it out. It says, thanks to the presenters for such a great conversation. One question for Professor Saldívar is, what has changed from the time that Américo Paredes wrote about the border and Mexicans in the United States? What has been achieved and what still needs to be overcome?
Sure.
More specifically, what should be the role of the border artist or the border writer, people that write about or use the border as their source of inspiration?
Yeah.
It's a question particularly for you, Ramon, but I think anyone can also.
Yeah, I'll say a quick a few words about it, but I would love to hear from Alejandra and Ivonne on that matter as well. Well, it seems to me that there's one thing to take into account today, that there is an absolute explosion, just or to use a different metaphor, a blossoming of literature, filmmaking, music making, drama performance on the border these days. Over the last 15, 20 years, a whole new generation of writers has appeared that that carries all of these same issues onto a different level. In in trying to respond to the way that things have stayed very depressingly the same, but that have also entered into new spheres of possibility for, coalition building and struggles linking to other struggles around the world. So I think that that's one big difference, that a new generation of writers and artists in general have emerged that see themselves as part of a broadly hemispheric movement and even broadly global. I think that is new. I think that at the time that Paredes was writing in the 1950s, when he links the corridos that he had been listening to from the 1900s to the ballads from the Scottish, Welsh, and Irish borders, in other words, from the early modern period in England as it became Great Britain, the United Kingdom. That was an extraordinary move on his part. Very few scholars were thinking that way. Today, I think that's sort of become more part of the way in which we conceive the local. That is, by thinking of it as a pattern embedded in larger global structures.
I can say something about that. I think for me, what has also changed a lot is the terminology that we use to identify ourselves. Yes. What is Mexican American now? I feel that it's a different definition for me than the one I saw Paredes is using.
Definitely.
And it's been changed, and it's also, I think, still in a moment of transition, negotiating those identity markers, such as who is Latino? Is that an encompassing identity for Afro-Indigenous people? Does it ally itself with the mestizo idea of the nation? So we're still negotiating even how to talk about ourselves. Though I do see that even then, that type of borderlands theory that I associate also a lot with Gloria Saldívar and feminist Chicano poetics, those are still fruitful ways of thinking of the way that our identities, by how difficult they are to define, end up disrupting disciplines, histories, and official narratives just by our simple act of existing.
Exactly, yeah.
If I may add something, it's not an answer to the question, but just a reflection, because, and I think, and your book on Paredes shows that, that if one think about the borderlands in abstract as a possibility, it sounds as a concept, as a place that would be rich with possibilities. It's always by definition very cosmopolitan. Many people, like you're mentioning, the Irish people becoming there, the African Americans, the Mexicans, the people from Latin America, from other places, the Native American people. So it seems like it could be such a fruitful experiment in another type of convivencia, another type of living with each other and forming alliances. And I guess, for example, there were those kind of alliances, the Flores Magón, for example, and but it seems like time and again, at least in this border, and I can say it probably the same thing for the southern border, the border between Mexico and Guatemala, it becomes dominated by what Mary Louise Pratt called a contact zone, and that you also bring it up in your book, that this unequal sources of power, they end up dominating everything. But the possibilities are there, and I would just recommend, now about poets or people who are working on the borderlands, the work of Heriberto Yepes, who was a graduate student here at Berkeley. He's writing very interesting poetry, not only poetry, but also novelas and essays about the borderlands.
Yes.
To that point, I actually have a question, which is regarding the kinds of objects that you all think are most important to study at this moment, because Alejandra both responded to and gave us a different idea of the necessity for Paredes in that moment of turning to the corrido because of racism, turning to the corrido because of a particular imperial system. And as Ivonne said, turning away from Henry James as a possibility. So when you all reflect on your own work right now, what kind of objects, cultural objects, do you think are most important to respond to the political situation of the day? If literature, novelas, poemas, etc., remains a primary resource, or if there are other, or songs, or posters, flyers, recetas, whatever, what kind of objects do you think are best suited to study in order to respond to this moment in history?
So I'll take a stab at that, and then again, I hope that Ivonne and Alejandra will add to what I have to say. But first of all, I think that all of the traditional cultural forms are at everyone's fingertips and are being used today, and so it's not so much have we abandoned traditional forms and moved to something else. It's that everything continues to be used as powerfully and fully as was ever used, but with interesting modifications. I think experimental film is very, very rich media for many of the ideas and topics that we're talking about. Music, of course. There's been extraordinary developments of modern music that take it, building from the traditional forms of music, on the border from the 18th century on, but are doing wonderful new experiments in sound. And of the various media, I've seen some really interesting uses of social media as a new platform for mixing, developing, adding forms together in new ways, and also developing new audiences. So those are some of the ways that Borderlands culture is developing formally. But I want to add one other thing, and I think it's related, and that is in terms of topics. What are some new topics that are very much a part of what are being explored in relation to the social justice issues that we've been talking about? Well, it seems to me that one is the environment, eco-criticism, and social environmental justice. I think that is a topic that is being embraced fully and has always been part of the conversation, but now is being focused on in very interesting ways. And of course, as you mentioned, a while ago, the way in which gender and sexual identity is being explored on the border is immensely interesting, and in ways that certainly have been signaled to by people as early as Gloria and Satu's work, but that are taking it, I think, even further these days. So those are some of the things that I think are happening that I'm very, very eager to continue to follow.
I agree. I think that increasingly in my own studies, I am moving away from traditional forms of literature because they're not what my community consumes. And it's a constant anxiety to feel that we need to align ourselves as minority scholars to the needs of our community. And my audience is not so engaged with literature. Corridos, they know that is their form of narrative and vernacular, and it is very rich and has a culture as deep as any literary history. But that if I am to reflect my own community that I come from, that I will inevitably have to veer into non-traditional forms. One that I know, Tom, I study is radio and the use of radio in Mexican households, especially from a female perspective, where radio is that constant accompaniment to your routine tasks. It's a way to connect to that imagined community of Benedict Anderson without physically holding a book and separating yourself from the world, from the needs of your daily life. You can still cook, you can clean while you listen to the radio, and you're still engaging with a broader literary culture. So I think paying more attention to the ways that groups imagine outside of that traditional reader are consuming culture and following their guides in what we study.
I cannot talk about what the objects and about the Borderlands are, because I don't know. I anecdotally, this graduate student here at Berkeley is also writing a really interesting dissertation on how at the Borderlands, towns are created out of refuse, no, things that are being recycled, and what kind of environmental and political statements, aesthetic statements might come out of that, which I think it's a very interesting project. I think that in our case, as people who are in literature departments, I'm really happy, and I'm not happy, but I think it's fair that we go out of this framework that is la ciudad letrada, at least coming from Latin America. No, it's and the realm of literature, and that one should be able to choose objects as they seem necessary to answer some questions. No, so what are the questions that you're asking from a period, from a moment, from even from a literary text? And it might be that asking a certain questions from a literary text will take you to objects that seem unseemingly appropriate, but they are appropriate to what you're doing. So I think that flexibility is very welcoming. At the same time, I do I do love novels and poetry still, no, and regardless, even if they're not a part of the projects that I might be engaging with in research, that other part of what we do, which is teaching, it's also very important not to have a very let's say canonical perspective, or to continue that canonical perspective to our students, but I think that precisely the words that we are, no, and that contamination, no, of Aymara, Quechua, Nahuatl, and what we teach in the works that we teach, it's also quite something worthwhile, not to continue doing.
There's a comment here in the Q&A box, and I don't know if any of you can kind of respond to it, but this comment is, it seems to me that the struggles that Mexicans on US soil during Juarez's time have not changed very much. The struggles persist. At times they have taken different forms, but the sad thing for me is that regardless of who's in office, things do not change much for this community or for any other ethnic group in the United States. I wonder how many more Americos do we need in order for our government leaders to hear our call and acknowledge our cultures? And I guess in some ways, the part of the conversation between Ramón and Ivonne at the beginning here was between this call of recognition and the ways to think differently about recognition. But yeah, I wonder if any of you do have a response to that, and also maybe some further thoughts about the need or potential for pedagogy, for different types of teaching to address, again, our place as educators, as graduate students, as undergraduate students at this moment.
Superb question and comment, rather, because it's depressingly true. In listening to presentations by my colleagues, my peers in the field, reading as broadly as I try to do, trying to stay up to date with what the current issues, methodologies, questions that Chicano, Latino, Latinx scholars are dealing with, one thing really stands out for me, and that is, everybody's really depressed. And they're depressed for exactly the reason that you point to, that, as bad as things are, as I said at one point in the talk, it's not new. We've seen it before. Now, and I think that that's part of the struggle these days, not just the struggle against the causes of injustice, but the effects of injustice, and how we keep the spirit of growth and aliveness and exploration and creativity alive within the community and for the next generation of students and future scholars and future leaders of the community. I remind myself that even within the Obama administration, there were 3 million Mexicans deported from the United States in the time of the Obama administration. So, Trump didn't add that to the misery of the community. He simply exploited it to an exponential level. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that as bad as things have always been, they can get worse. And we're seeing the worst being played out right now, and probably have not seen the worst of the worst. So for me, the issue really becomes, how do you keep alive the need to do the work that Paredes was doing for his generation, the work that, our cohort of scholars is doing for the present and younger generation and moving toward the future. I think one thing to keep in mind is that there isn't a beginning and there isn't an end. There has to be an ongoing process of trying to work through matters of social justice.
Ivonne or Alejandra, did you want to add anything?
It's true, but at the same time, it's just that, and of course we're very privileged, and because we're here in California, and this is a whole different political situation and expectation. But I think I see it with the undergraduate students, and I guess it's the same experience for Ramón and Alejandra too, for everyone here, that I think things that I had to begin to question, they're not the beginning point for them. Or I see it at the education of my son, who's 17. They start at a different place, and it gives me hope that perhaps they're growing with this different perspective might be helpful in the future, because they're not in the same place as what you were saying, Ramón, what Americo Paredes was seeing in school, or even what I was seeing in school. This is another beginning, but also to think that should not let us just, we have to think further in how to do it, because it's a very challenging situation. No, it's not to say, okay, the young people would be in charge.
Yeah.
Alejandra, it's your task.
There you go.
No,
I completely agree.
No. It's not to say it's not a responsibility anymore. It is, to. Mm-hmm.
I'm being a young person. I'll respond as a young person. I do think that I see that what has not changed is kind of what we're up against, that the racist rhetoric, the society that we live in seems very stagnant in a way, but that our response is so different, and what the Mexican American community knows now is so different, how we're using our culture in new ways. And I see it in people younger than me, that they already have ideas outside of traditional gender norms of Mexican culture, that look at our nationality as already a construct too limiting, that are seeing themselves as more, in a more global perspective, connected to luchas in all different countries. So I do have a hope in a long term, that people even 5 years younger than me know or so much more already about themselves.
Yes, I completely agree. That's my hope too.
So another question here from the audience puts some of this forward a little bit more. It says, how can Paredes help us think about relational racialization, such as between Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, and Latinx people, and even between Latinx groups, such as how Central Americans are racialized as Mexican at this political moment?
Sure.
Also, how might a relational perspective change what counts as a border? And finally, how might we as educators try and impart a relational understanding of race onto our students and other interlocutors, or an understanding that would allow us to better grasp how local issues are instances of broader global patterns?
Again, that's an excellent point, and an explanation that I completely agree with, and I agree with it for this reason, that I think one of the things that Paredes' work showed, and that he was aware of, maybe not within the vocabulary that we use today about relationality, but of contextuality and interrelationship and community building, what I called shared communities of faith in the brief comment that I made. I know that's a contemporary phrase too, but I think that's where he was pointing. That is that racial and ethnic categories are constituted by one's actions, by how one interrelates with one's family, with one's community, with one's sphere of interaction, and that's where an identity is forged. And because of that, because it occurs in that relational way, the concept of community and racialized identity is open. It's not exclusive. It's not delimited. So that one of the things that I mentioned was Paredes' encounter in Tokyo in 1947 with a woman who was half Latina and half Japanese, and who in effect taught him about how to negotiate Asian cultures, Japanese culture in particular, by her family interactions in Japanese and in Spanish. And I think that struck a chord for Paredes, because bilinguality and biculturality were part of the world that he grew up in. Half of Paredes' family lived on the northern side of the border, and half lived on the southern side of the border. So the interaction was always back and forth, moving into structures of interrelationship as a way of life. I think that the questioner is absolutely right, that's a center part of his thinking that I think is very much still at play for us today.
Alejandra, you want to?
You can go first, Ivonne, if you have something to say. Tampoco, creo que esa pregunta muy grande para mí.
Yes, no, it's not. I know it's not. It's a very complex issue, because if it's true that not to say that racial problems or racialization does not exist south of the border. Of course not. But I think that once you enter the US, the game changes. No, so it changes. For example, are people who in Latin America would be obviously indigenous people, are they, once they cross the border, Native Americans? No, probably not, but they are. No,
Yeah.
they, so so that is to say that the U.S., because it has hegemonic power, it changes the game that of what is happening outside the borders, and also that we have to recognize that what is happening as and I truly believe this, that the U.S. should learn from Latin America politically. But I also think that we cannot lose sight of the fact that Latin America is what is happening in Bolivia, but it's also what was happening in Bolivia a few months ago. That is to say that, or that there's a part of Latin America that, even though has a discourse against Trump domestically, they would be the Trumps of Latin America, no?
Yeah.
So that also does exist, and that also we have 30%, I believe, of the Latinx population in the U.S. voting for Trump, which
Yeah.
for any rational person that would be, I'm sorry, I cannot even understand that.
Yeah.
So that would I would have to go to start from kindergarten again to get to a decision where that is possible. No.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always shocked by it, even though it's a common enough experience that we've all seen it. That it is, for me, the only way to explain it, a living version of the power of hegemony. Hegemony works not when you're forced to do something, but when you believe it, when you come to believe it for yourself. And that's what's happening. And it comes from the schools, it comes from popular culture, it comes from the world around you. So all the more, that's an argument for countering hegemony by using its own tools.
I think I'm also thinking of how to think of similarities and differences in the ways we are racialized across groups.
Yes.
And I noticed that tension that you highlighted in your book between the transnational and the local, and that time when it gets fuzzy, whether I'm thinking of Nuestra América by Jose Marti.
Sure, exactly.
This kind of transnational moment where there's a desire for North and South hemispheres to unite against imperialism, that there's this very strong rebuttal coming from South America that, no, we're actually not like North America. We are our own dynamic and a different response. So to also see the limits of our relationality, and to know when our rights stop and another's rights begin.
Yes.
It's important for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For me, just on an experiential and personal level, I grew up in South Texas. There, the patterns were just what Paredes describes in his book, very binary. There were Mexicans and there were Anglos. There were a few African Americans and a few indigenous people, but they were not, sufficiently visible as part of the antagonism, and the antagonism was very, very cleanly delineated. My wife is from New Mexico. She was born in Santa Fe, and whenever we visit her family there, it's a completely different world. Well, not completely different, but different. It's not binary. The presence of the indigenous past and present is unmistakable. And that adds a layer, a vector rather, to the relationality structures that I'm familiar with. And they're complicated and messy and not always what you want them to be.
So we do have a question from Rob, actually, who, and I think this question is really directed to you, Ramon, but he says, in a recent presentation for an audience in Texas that you did via Zoom, likewise taking up the question of what Paredes might have to offer today. You know, do you see or do you sense any differences there in Texas that led to questions and responses that are perhaps different from our own in the conversation that we're having right now?
You know, interestingly, no. You know, I think we would like there to be more of a pronounced difference, but I didn't sense it. You know, in part it's because, you know, I was in Austin. You know, Austin, Texas is so much like, well, I don't want to say Palo Alto because Palo Alto is its own place, but it's like Berkeley, you know, in its openness and its multi-ethnic, complicated interactions in culture and politics. And so the audience at the University of Texas was really very much like that. Clearly, they weren't all from Austin; they were from throughout Texas. But to have chosen to go to UT Austin said something about the students who were there already. So, you know, it reminds me too that when I first came to the Bay Area, to Stanford, people used to say to me all the time, especially here at Stanford, wow, I bet you don't miss Texas at all. I bet you're so glad to be out of there. And I would look at them and I would say, what? I don't see the difference. California is so much like Texas, you know, and not just Austin. But then they say, how? I said, well, the Mexican presence for one, you know, the Hispanic cultures generally, the racism, those are not different. And, you know, I think the reality of Texas for itself, though, is that that I think Paredes represents a recognizable past that is still very much alive in the present, and that points to a future that is understandable. And I think that's why I didn't sense a difference from the kind of reaction that I get here in California to Paredes' work.
Great, thank you. We don't have any questions from the audience at this moment. Do any of you have questions for each other? I don't want to force you to ask anything, but if you do have something, Ivonne?
I do have a question.
I do too.
For him. Oh,
Go ahead.
No, that's not fair. You're the presenter.
Okay.
You're the one who gets the questions. I was when you said that Americo Paredes went against the grain and wrote this very unusual interdisciplinary book, and I thought your book was in a very different way the same. No, that is to say, it's an unusual academic book. No,
Yeah.
it's like you allow vignettes in which Paredes is talking about his life, and then you talk about his life, and then it's theory, and then it's history, and it's a great model because it's not a an intellectual biography. It's very different. So how did you come up with that form?
That's a good question. And really the honest answer is by accident. You know, you know, and then once I saw it, it was like, aha, there's an opportunity here to do something very different than I've done in my other books.
Okay.
And the accident was simply this, that I was writing this book and I was going to do basically a book of critical literary scholarship, reading the poems and the short stories and the novel, not so much reading Paredes as an ethnographer, because, you know, that wasn't my field. And I didn't see what I would gain from going that way. I was going to stay with the literature. But, you know, we were colleagues at the University of Texas for a while, had overlapped 2 or 3 years, and then I had come to Stanford. And so because of that, I decided, well, maybe I can interview him. And the interviews, which I had envisioned, you know, an afternoon over a cup of coffee, extended over a full week of hours and hours of audio and videotapes. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he said to me, you know, I haven't been to South Texas in over 15 years, and I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to go again. And so I thought, aha. And I volunteered to take him to South Texas. And so we went together and spent a week in the valley, meeting his family, talking to his friends, visiting old places. And that, by accident, gave me a mountain of material that didn't fit into the traditional literary critical format that I had envisioned. So it meant I had to start all over again. And how was I going to deal with this other informal material that was now in my hands? And that's where the book evolved. And as if that wasn't enough, that was when I also learned, he mentioned casually to me, you know, I wrote a bunch of articles when I was in Japan for the US Army newspaper. Oh, and by the way, I also wrote a whole bunch for a Mexico City newspaper, Universal, in Spanish. And he didn't have records of them, you know. So I was able to track them all down at Berkeley, at Stanford, in Tokyo, and at the Smithsonian. And that also gave me a body of material that I just had no idea existed. That were those interesting articles as he was living them day by day in occupation Japan. So I don't think I could ever replicate that again. There were too many things that happened by accident.
There's another question here from the audience, which is that throughout, and it relates to what you're just talking about. It says, throughout today's conversation, we've heard the panelists discuss the idea of Americo as a poet before all else, of using song and other forms as alternative objects from which to make larger arguments about culture. Yes. And Alejandra acknowledged using such objects in academic analysis as part of a political work of preserving unofficial histories.
Yeah.
One question already asked what sorts of objects we should engage with today, but I'm wondering whether our scholarship should change. How we make claims to knowledge, whether that should also take new forms today. How, and I think you've just given us one example of that, Ramón, with your own work, and how might we change the ways we're asking undergraduate or graduates to produce work in light of these observations?
Yeah. Also, just a very, very excellent, thought-provoking question. Well, you know, in part, I'm going to turn to Paredes for a possible answer here. And it was something he said to me, you know, when I sort of asked him a similar question. You know, if I were to continue doing stuff like this, how would I go? Where would I go? How did you do it? And he said to me, I began with what was most directly in front of me, so present that I sometimes didn't even realize I was seeing it, and use that as a base rather than going to archives or encyclopedias or histories or whatever. Starting, in other words, with the world that he lived. And if we're looking for documentary evidence, that holds for that too. And what he said to me that he envisioned doing but never actually did was something that he called the Castaña Project. That he wanted to go to all of the old friends, all of the old families, all of the, you know, the elders of the community, and ask for their permission to dig around in their castañas, in their, you know, in their family storage boxes to see what he could find. And he says, I bet you'd find treasures there, letters, birth certificates, baptismals, you know, private notes that don't make it into the official repositories of history. And I would say, what is the equivalent today? You know, what are those kinds of ephemeral repositories of knowledge that are before us, but we lose sight of? Start there.
Ivonne or Alejandra? Any thoughts on kind of new forms of both teaching writing, I guess, or teaching research, and or forms that you yourself are already practicing?
Yeah, that's an exciting question to me. As a grad student, we turn in final papers at the end of every semester, and that's our form of knowledge, the prescribed way to present the knowledge that we study, even when the objects that we study are so distant from a type of essay format. And I think that going forward and looking at this book, which treats the person, like Paredes, as a person, as well as his intellectual and academic work, that we should feel encouraged to bring our personal history into the classroom. And that's often one of the deepest reservoirs of where we can theorizing from our personal experience, creating our knowledge from our very local and immediate environments. And I think that's a hard question that we would have to change a lot of the way that we do things in our academic circles. Might be presented in other ways. I know in a class that I was in with Tom, we were allowed to create multimedia objects instead of final papers, to present things in cassette tapes or as videos. So there's a lot of different ways to express what we know. And I hope that that's something that's encouraged as we move forward.
Ivonne, you also maybe had a last question. We're coming up to the end of our event, but did you have another question that you wanted to ask, or no? Okay.
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, Ivonne, do you have any last thoughts about these kind of new forms of education, or?
Well, I'm for them. I mean, especially I think that with undergraduate students, and some of them who come from, I imagine, pretty good high schools, they train them so well that it's very difficult to untrain them. That is, yeah. They want to write essays that are so structured that it's good to have that foundation, but then it's good to leave it behind. You know, so I just try to push them to leave that format. It's also because it's, for us, it's boring to have the same form over and over again, regardless of the content, no? But which doesn't mean to abandon rigor, no? We can all be rigorous in different forms. So I'm all for that. And in the case of graduate students, I am all for that, but I also recognize the limits of the market. that you remain a recognizable academic to the outside world until you have tenure, and then you can do whatever you want. Mm-hmm.
That's true. I have one quick thought on that, and this is something that I've tried with my graduate students here at Stanford without much success, but I still think it's a good idea. And that is, instead of doing the boring, same old, individually authored term paper, why not do a collective paper? Oh. Three or four of you getting together, doing the research together, fighting it out, discussing and writing together, and you all get the same grade. You can imagine how students felt about that. I still think it's a good idea, but I'm all for the crowdsourcing of knowledge and the products of knowledge.
Well, thank you all so much for
thank you.
The conversation today. It's really been wonderful to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So
much,
Rob, anything you want to say? Sorry, go ahead.
Just saying thank you to all three of you. Those were really stimulating and thought-provoking presentations. Really.
Thank you. This is just a really fun evening, and I immensely appreciate all of the work that you did to put this event together. Thank you.
And thanks to our audience for being with us and attending, and those who generated questions and those who are just taking things in and thinking with the speakers. We really appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mil gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Gracias. Chao.
Cuídense. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.